He is looking in the mirror. Not just passing by, pay attention. The head tilted to one side, then to the other. The beak almost touching the surface. The eyes fixed on that reflection that returns exactly the same posture, the same angle, the same green and yellow that it carries on its body. And you observe this scene and think you know what's happening. It thinks it's another bird. It's socializing with an illusion. It's cute. It's harmless. It's the simple way a simple animal passes the time. This interpretation is wrong, profoundly wrong. What happens when your parakeet encounters its own reflection isn't confusion. It's one of the most philosophically charged moments in the life of a non-human animal. And what neuroscience and ethology have discovered about what goes through its nervous system at that moment puts a question at the heart of everything you believe about your bird's mind. A question that human philosophers took centuries to formulate. A question that your parakeet may be answering in its own way, silently, every time you're not looking. Does he even know it exists? Most people would respond with a condescending smile. Of course not. It's a parakeet. Self-awareness is a human thing, a primate thing at most, not a 40-gram bird that eats birdseed and fights with its own reflection. This response is comforting. It's organized. And it's the kind of certainty that the latest science is dismantling with a delicacy that seems almost uncomfortable. Welcome to Wild Mind, the channel that exists to ask the questions that common sense prefers not to ask. Subscribe now so you don't miss what avian neuroscience discovers every week about the beings that share your space without you really knowing them. Turn on notifications and stay until the end of this video, because the last point isn't about the parakeet. It's about what it means to be conscious. And it will leave you with a question that won't go away. There is a parakeet referred to by researchers simply as subject K male, adult, kept in a controlled laboratory environment at Keio University in Japan during a months-long study whose results were published and received by the scientific community with a mixture of astonishment and resistance. The experiment was the mirror test, the standard protocol for assessing self-awareness in animals. A colored mark is applied to the animal's body at a point it can only see through the reflection. If the animal touches or inspects the mark on its own body while seeing the reflection, this is interpreted as evidence that it recognizes the image as itself, not as another individual, as itself. Great apes pass, elephants pass, dolphins pass, crows pass in adapted versions of the test, and parakeets for decades have been placed in the category of those who don't pass. Those who look in the mirror and see another bird. Those who don't cross that boundary that separates self-recognition from recognition of the other. Subject K changed that narrative. After weeks of controlled exposure to unmarked mirrors, during which the bird ceased exhibiting social behaviors directed at its reflection, the mark was applied, and Subject K, upon seeing the reflection with the mark, turned its beak toward its own body, to the marked spot, not toward the mirror, to itself. A 30-second gesture that raised a question that still lacks a consensus answer in science, but one that can no longer be ignored. But self-awareness, if it exists in the parakeet, does not operate in a vacuum. It exists within a dense social context that completely transforms what this self-recognition could mean for them. In wild flocks, a parakeet's individual identity isn't abstract, it's functional. Each bird has a specific, unique call that persists throughout its life. A vocalization that is, in every sense that matters, a name. Other flock members recognize this call. They respond specifically to it. And when two parakeets form a stable pair, something even more striking happens. They subtly modify their own calls toward that of their partner. A gradual vocal convergence that researchers describe as the construction of a shared identity. They are not just individuals with names. They are individuals who negotiate their own identity in relation to others, who change themselves to get closer to those they love, who carry in their hearts the signature of each bond they have ever formed. If this isn't relational self-awareness, science hasn't yet found a better name for what is. And when a partner disappears, the survivor's call to contact changes. It loses the convergence that had been built. It slowly returns to its original form, as if grief, among parakeets, were a process of relearning who you are without the other. But the question of consciousness doesn't exist solely in the social realm. It exists in the sensory realm as well. And what the parakeet perceives of itself and the world around it is filtered through a system of senses that makes its subjective experience radically different from yours. Remember the 4 photoreceptors in the retina, including the ultraviolet channel? This means that the image the parakeet sees in the mirror is not the same as the one you see when you look at it. Its feathers, in UV light, display patterns of contrast and markings that are invisible to the human eye. When it looks at its reflection, it is seeing a version of itself that you have never seen. An image loaded with information about health, hormonal status, and individual identity that the human visual channels simply cannot access. He sees more of himself than you will ever see of him. And his auditory system processes his own vocalizations with a temporal resolution that allows him to distinguish nuances in his own voice that the human ear merges into a single sound. He hears himself in more detail than you hear him. In sensory terms, he has richer access to his own presence in the world than any human instrument can capture. If consciousness has anything to do with the ability to perceive one's own existence, the parakeet possesses the sensory tools for this with a sophistication that defies simplistic narratives. But here's where science contradicts what you've probably heard, and the misconception is old enough to seem true. The prevailing idea for decades was that the mirror test was the only valid criterion for assessing self-awareness in non-human animals. Those who touched the mark passed. Those who didn't failed. And parakeets, in most studies, didn't touch it. Therefore, no self-awareness. Case closed. The problem is that the mirror test was developed for animals that use their hands or snout to explore their own bodies. For a bird, touching its own plumage with its beak at a specific point is a much more complex motor gesture than touching its own forehead with its hand. The absence of the behavior may be a motor limitation, not a lack of recognition. More recent studies have used adapted protocols, versions of the test that do not require direct physical manipulation. And in these versions, parakeets demonstrated behaviors that researchers describe as consistent with recognizing their own reflection as themselves. The absence of proof was not proof of absence. It was a methodological flaw. Science hasn't proven that parakeets are self-aware, but it can no longer comfortably assert that they aren't either. Now it rises. It leaves the cage. It leaves the laboratory. It expands until the question fits on a scale that goes far beyond a specific bird. Consciousness is the most difficult question in science, not because there is a lack of data, because there is a lack of consensus about what we are measuring when we measure consciousness. The philosopher David Chalmers called this the hard problem of consciousness, the question of why there is something that is like being a particular being, a subjective experience, an internal point of view, rather than just processing information in the dark. You are certain you have consciousness because you experience it internally, but you cannot be absolutely certain that any other being also has it. You infer it, based on behavior, based on neural structure, based on similarity to yourself. And what avian neuroscience is revealing, study after study, is that a budgerigar's brain is not a simple stimulus-response system. It's an information processor with structures homologous to those in the human brain associated with emotion, memory, planning, and self-perception. Not identical to human structures. Homologous. Different evolutionary solutions to similar cognitive problems. Consciousness, if it is the product of a certain complexity of information processing, may not be a human prerogative. It may be a spectrum, and your parakeet may be at some point on that spectrum that is not zero, and that is not where you are, but that is also not the absence that you assumed it to be. The cosmos produced billions of years of matter without any subjective experience. And then, at some point, matter began to wonder what it was. We call this consciousness when it happens within us. When it happens in different forms, in neural systems that are not our own, we still don't know what to call it. The parakeet looking in the mirror might be one of those moments. Matter finding itself in a form that our category doesn't yet know how to name. Back to the beginning. To the mirror. To him looking at himself with his head tilted. You'll never see this scene the same way again. Not because science has proven that he is conscious, but because science can no longer prove that he is not. And in that space between proof and doubt lies a responsibility that is yours. The responsibility to treat a being as if his internal experience mattered, even before you are absolutely certain that it exists. Because if you wait for certainty, you might be waiting too long, and he'll keep looking in the mirror alone in an environment that doesn't deliver what his nervous system was built to receive, while the philosophical question awaits resolution in some laboratory. The most honest question this video can leave you with isn't whether your parakeet knows you exist. It's what you're going to do now that you're no longer sure if it doesn't know. Leave a comment describing what you felt when he looked in the mirror for the last time. and what that scene means to you now. We read everything. If this video touched you, share it with someone who also has a parakeet at home. And if you're not yet subscribed to Wild Mind, start now. The next video is coming soon, and it goes even deeper.